Okay, so as I said, our main message today is in regard to what is referred to as the Gog Magog War um, and the Battle of Armageddon. And again, this paper was written by Brian Huey. He's actually passed away now, but his website is still up and running. And in chapter 38 and 39 of the prophetic book of Ezekiel, a future attack on Israel initiated by a leader called Gog is detailed. And just to give you a little bit of background, the Gog and Magog, um, many scholars believe that they are the Russian people, the nations of Russia. And it could include, China as well. Other scholars think that it's Turkey. So there's not really a consensus on who it is. Other things that I've read agree with the Russia-China combination, because it often talks about the hordes that come with them. So when you look at it really, when you look at the end time segregation of peoples, you have the Israelites, and then you have this Russia, Middle East, China conglomerate, and I'm sure other nations are sucked into that, but that seems to be the way it shapes up. But again, there's no consensus on that, so we have to kind of, again, keep our eyes open and our ear to the ground, so to speak, so that we know what's going on. So over in Ezekiel 38, 1 through 7, it says, "The word of Yehovah came to me, Son of man, set your face toward Gog, and of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal." So Meshech, if you look up ancient Meshech, um, it it seems to be a precursor or an ancient version of Moscow. They when you look it up, you can see how it evolved over time, but it ends up being Moscow. And I think that's why a lot of scholars, link it to Russia. But anyway, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, "Thus says Adonai Yehovah, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn you about and put hooks into your jaws, and I will bring you out, and all your army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed in full armor, a great host, all of them with buckler and shield, wielding swords. Persia, Cush, and Put are with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all his hordes, Beth Togarmah, from the uttermost parts of the north with all his hordes. Many peoples are with you. Be ready and keep ready, you and all your hosts that are assembled about you, and be a guard for them." Now, as I said, there are many theories about the modern identity of the nations listed here as being involved in this attack. And who these nations are is not the focus of this particular article. Instead, we're going to look at the timing of this event to determine where it falls in the prophetic timeline of the end of the age. So it's not really focusing on who they are, but more the timing of what's happening. Many today teach that Gog-Magog war will occur before the rise of the Antichrist. According to this view, the Gog-Magog war precedes the final battle of Armageddon by several years. But is this an accurate understanding of Scripture? Is the Gog-Magog war a separate event from Armageddon, or is it the same one? The goal of this article is to show from the Scriptures that these are not separate events, but rather different names for the same event. And we know that, there were different prophets throughout history that prophesied the same events. They might have described them a little bit differently, but it does happen and did happen. So Ezekiel's prophecy continues with a description of what Gog and his armies decide to do to the people of God who dwell in the physical land of Israel at that time. In Ezekiel 38, 8 through 13, it says, "After many days you will be mustered. In the latter years you will go against the land that is restored from war, the land whose people were gathered from many peoples upon the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste. Its people were brought out from the peoples and now dwell securely, all of them. You will advance, coming like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land, you and all your hordes and many peoples with you. Thus says Adonai Yahovah, on that day thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil scheme and say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will fall upon the quiet people who dwell securely, all of them dwelling without walls and having no bars or gates, to seize spoil and carry off plunder, to turn your hand against the waste places that are now inhabited, and the people who were gathered from the nations, who have acquired livestock and goods, who dwell at the center of the earth. Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and all its leaders will say to you, have you come to seize spoil? Have you assembled your hosts to carry off plunder, to carry away silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods, to seize great spoil? Now this prophecy speaks of a time after displaced Israelites have returned to the Holy Land from the nations into which they had been scattered. Right? So at the time Gog decides to invade Israel, Israel will have been restored from war. The people of Israel will then be dwelling safely in unprotected towns on the mountains of Israel. And they will have accumulated a large amount of material goods. So Mr. Huey places this event, and I can see where he gets it, right? It appears to be after the scattered tribes of Israel are brought back to Israel. Continuing on now in Ezekiel 38, we'll read verses 14 through 16. It says, Therefore, son of man, prophesy and say to Gog, Thus says Adonai Yahovah, on that day when my people Israel are dwelling securely, will you not know it? You will come from your place out of the utter parts of the north, right? So that gives you an indication also of where these people are located. They're in the north. And whether it be in the north from Israel, which obviously Russia is, but so is Turkey. So, it could be a combination, collective, I don't know, but they're in the utter parts of the north. And you can't get much more north than Russia. You and many peoples with you, all of them riding on horses, a great host, a mighty army. You will come up against my people Israel, like a cloud covering the land. In the latter days I will bring you against my land, that the nations may know me, when through you, O Gog, I vindicate my holiness before their eyes. So in the introduction to this prophecy, we're told that God will cause Gog to gather a great army from the nations to attack Israel at a time when they are back in the Holy Land and living in undefended towns and settlements. And the reason God states for provoking Gog to do this is so the nations may truly know that he is God, understand who he is. And clearly, Ezekiel is speaking here of a time when all the earth doesn't yet understand who the true God is. Obviously, today that is very true. Even Israel doesn't know who God is. Israel doesn't even know who they are. So they certainly don't know who God is. So the great army brought together by Gog is said to come from the north. The gathering of this army is also spoken of by the Apostle John in the 16th chapter of Revelation. In Revelation 16, 12 through 16, we read the following. It says, "The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, to prepare the way for the kings from the east. And I saw, coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, three unclean spirits like frogs. For they are demonic spirits, performing signs, who go abroad to the kings of the whole world, to assemble them for battle on the great day of God, the Almighty. Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake, keeping his garments on, so that he may not go about naked and be seen exposed. And they assembled them at the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon." And so one thing I would like to note here is that we need to be staying awake. We need to be keeping our garments on. That means we need to be right with our Creator. There, in my opinion, again, this is my opinion, there has never been a time in the history of humanity when it was so critical for God's people to make sure that they are staying right with their Creator. I believe that we are on the verge of major events in prophecy occurring. Now, I could be wrong. I'm not saying this matter-of-factly, but I think it's just a short time. So, Armageddon is a Greek transliteration of the Hebrew Har Megiddo, or the hill of Megiddo. However, lying below that hill is the real focus of the prophecy, and that is the plain of Esdraelon, also known as the plain of Megiddo or the valley of Jezreel. And as we see here on the map, the plain of Esdraelon is approximately 55 miles north of Jerusalem. You don't see Jerusalem on this map, but and 20 miles southeast of the modern Israeli port of Haifa, which you can see over here, right here by the Mediterranean Sea, and just to the south of Nazareth, right? And you can see Nazareth, the little red square on the map here, is the plain of Esdraelon. And it's the plain of Esdraelon that the armies from the east, having traveled across the dried up Euphrates River, which is highlighted in this map in yellow, that they will join with Gog's forces for their planned assault on those living on the mountains of Israel to the south. So, just to give you kind of a visual image of, what this looks like. But going back to Ezekiel, we see that God is not going to allow the prophetic beast called Gog to succeed in his plans. You look at Ezekiel 38, we'll read 17 through 20. It says, "Thus says Adonai Yahovah, are you he of whom I spoke in former days by my servants the prophets of Israel, who in those days prophesied for years that I would bring you against them? But on that day, the day that Gog shall come against the land of Israel, declares Adonai Yahovah, my wrath will be roused in my anger. For in my jealousy and in my blazing wrath I declare, on that day there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. The fish of the sea and the birds of the heaven and the beasts of the field and all creeping things that creep on the ground and all the people who are on the face of the earth shall quake at my presence." Now, I'm pretty sure that hasn't happened yet. At least there's no record of it ever happening. So we're looking at a future event. Continuing on, it says, "And the mountains shall be thrown down, and the cliffs shall fall, and every wall shall tumble to the ground." Now that's a pretty serious earthquake. So here we see the first thing that will occur when God's wrath is poured out on Gog is that a great earthquake will shake in the land of Israel. In fact, the earthquake will be so massive that it will cause the mountains to crumble and every wall to collapse. And there's another earthquake mentioned by the prophet Zechariah, over in Zechariah 14, verses 3 through 5, where it says, "Then Yehovah will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. And on that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that one half of the mount shall move northward, and the other half southward. And you shall flee to the valley of my mountains. For the valley of the mountains shall reach Azal, and you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah king of Judah. Then Yehovah, my Elohim, will come, and all the holy ones with him." So speaking of an event that will occur after the end-time capture and subjugation of Jerusalem, from Zechariah 14, 1 and 2, Zechariah tells us of a great earthquake that will strike the land of Israel, specifically the Mount of Olives, when Jesus returns. In fact, the earthquake will be directly related to the Messiah's feet coming to rest on the Mount of Olives. As prophesied, Jesus will return to the same location he left from many centuries earlier. And I think this is a bit of an opinion of Mr. Huey's. If you look at the book of Acts, chapter 1, verses 9 through 12, he says, "And when he had said these things, as they were looking on, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. And while they were gazing into heaven as he went, behold, two men stood by them in white robes, and said, 'Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? This Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven.' Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey away." Right? So he interprets that as, because it says, as you saw him go, so also he will come, right? So he takes that to literally be the location and in the way that they saw, which could very well be. I'm not saying it's not. So the earthquake which takes place at the return of Jesus is the same one spoken of in Revelation. If you look at Revelation 16, verses 17 through 20, it says, "The seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne, saying, 'It is done.' And there were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a great earthquake, such as there had never been since man was on the earth. So great was that earthquake. The great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and God remembered Babylon the Great to make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. And every island fled away, and no mountains were to be found. So here we see several parallels to Ezekiel's prophecy regarding the earthquake, which will strike at the time of that Gog attempts to attack Israel, or does attack Israel. So first we see that this mammoth quake will level all the mountains. We see it in Ezekiel 38:20 and in Revelation 16:20. Additionally, we see that the earthquake will cause the walls of the cities of the nations to collapse in Ezekiel 38:20 and Revelation 16:19. Since the mountains and cities of the earth can only be destroyed one time, and again, I think that's not necessarily true. I mean, a city can be rebuilt and destroyed again. But it's clear that these two passages are speaking of the same events. So at least there is a close correlation. Now, next, Ezekiel begins to speak of what will happen to Gog's armies. If we look at Ezekiel 38:21, where it says, I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares Adonai Yahovah. Every man's sword will be against his neighbor or his brother. So Ezekiel tells us that armies of the nations that Gog has assembled together will turn on one another instead of attacking Israel. In the 14th chapter of Zechariah, we see a similar description of how this battle will turn out. You look over there at Zechariah 14, we'll read verses 12 through 15. It says, And this shall be the plague with which Jehovah will strike all the peoples that wage war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are still standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. And on that day a great panic from Jehovah shall fall on them, so that each will seize the hand of another, and the hand of the one will be raised against the hand of the other. Even Judah will fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations shall be collected, gold, silver, and garments in great abundance. And a plague like this plague shall fall on the horses, the mules, the camels, the donkeys, and whatever beasts may be in those camps. So Zechariah records that when God strikes the armies advancing on Jerusalem and starts causing the soldiers to instantly decay in their tracks, tremendous fear will come upon all of them. And this fear will cause the armies to panic and lash out at whoever is within striking distance. And ironically, it appears that many of the invaders will kill each other. And we've seen that before in prophecy, in Scripture. Let's look at Ezekiel 38:22. Where it says, With pestilence and bloodshed I will enter into judgment with him, and I will rain upon him and his hordes and the many peoples who are with him torrential rains and hailstones, fire and sulfur. Now, an interesting feature of this description of God's destruction of Gog's troops is the mention of great hailstones which fall upon the troops. Because we see the same hailstones being described in John's account recorded in Revelation. Over in Revelation chapter 16, in verse 21, it says, And great hailstones, about 100 pounds each, fell from heaven on people, and they cursed God for the plague of the hail, because the plague was so severe. So at the end of Ezekiel 38, God once again reveals why he is going to incite Gog to attack Israel and then destroy his armies in such a spectacular manner. If you look over in Ezekiel chapter 38, And I know we're bouncing back and forth, so it's kind of hard to keep up. Ezekiel 38, verse 23 says, "So I will show my greatness and my holiness and make myself known in the eyes of many nations." And this is the key. And I wrote a whole sermon on this phrase. Then they will know that I am Yehovah. And this is what the whole purpose of this is to prove to the world that he is Yehovah. He is the one true God, and there is none other. In chapter 39, Ezekiel continues to prophesy about the fate of Gog and his armies. Turn over to Ezekiel 39. We'll read verses 1 through 5. Verse 1, it starts, "And you, son of man, prophesy against Gog and say, Thus says Adonai Yehovah, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And I will turn you about and drive you forward, and bring you up from the uttermost parts of the north, and lead you against the mountains of Israel. Then I will strike your bow from your left hand, and will make your arrows drop from your right hand. You shall fall in the mountains of Israel, you and all your hordes, and all the peoples who are with you. I will give you to birds of prey of every sort, and to the beasts of the field to be devoured. You shall fall in the open field, for I have spoken, declares Adonai Yehovah." And then later in 39th chapter of Ezekiel's prophecy, we'll see more detailed description of how the birds of prey will be used to consume those slain armies of Gog. But continuing on in Ezekiel 39, verses 6 through 8, it says, "I will send fire on Magog and on those who dwell securely in the coastlands, and they shall know that I am Yehovah. And my holy name I will make known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let my holy name be profaned anymore." You see, when we call ourselves people of God, when we take the moniker of a Christian, right, and then we don't do what God tells us to do, if we don't follow his way, his commandments, observe his calendar, then we profane his name. We take his name in vain. He said his name will not be profaned anymore. "And the nations shall know that I am Yehovah, the Holy One in Israel. Behold, it is coming, and it will be brought about, declares Adonai Yehovah. That is the day of which I have spoken." So once again, God reiterates that this event is designed to show the whole world who Yehovah truly is. But verse 7 gives us some additional information. This great deliverance will also make Yehovah known to his own people, Israel. God states that from this point forward, his holy name will no longer be profaned in Israel. Not only will this event introduce the one true God to the world, it will also make him known and holy in the eyes of his people, Israel. Now, next, Ezekiel describes the aftermath of the slaughter and how the land will be cleansed following the battle. Look at Ezekiel 39. We'll read verses 9 through 16, and we're going to read this in the JPS Tanakh. It says, "Then the inhabitants of the cities of Israel will go out and make fires and feed them with the weapons, shields and bucklers, bows and arrows, clubs and spears. They shall use them as fuel for 7 years. They will not gather firewood in the fields or cut any in the forests, but will use the weapons as fuel for their fires. They will despoil those who despoiled them and plunder those who plundered them, declares Adonai Yehovah. On that day I will assign to Gog a burial site there in Israel, the valley of the travelers, east of the sea. It shall block the path of travelers, for there Gog and all his multitudes will be buried. It shall be called the valley of Gog's multitude. The house of Israel shall spend 7 months burying them, in order to cleanse the land, and all the people of the land shall bury them. The day I manifest my glory shall bring renown to them, declares Adonai Yehovah. And they shall appoint men to serve permanently, to traverse the land and bury any invaders who remain above ground, in order to cleanse it. The search shall go on for a period of 7 months. As those who traverse the country make their rounds, any one of them who sees a human bone shall erect a marker beside it, until the buriers have interred them in the valley of Gog's multitude. There shall also be a city named Multitude, and thus the land shall be cleansed. Ezekiel records that this revelation of the power of God will bring honor to Israel. For 7 months, the people of Israel will be engaged in burying the remains of Gog's armies. The weapons carried by them will be burned for fuel for 7 years. That's a lot of weapons. Since there will be no need to cut any trees, obviously, the land will be allowed to heal. You know, we've wreaked such havoc on this planet and done so much damage to this creation, it's really hard to fathom. And so, after discussing the disposition of the remains of Gog's armies very briefly, God then directs Ezekiel to address in greater detail the immediate aftermath of the battle. So we continue on in verses 17 through 20. Verse 17, it starts as for you, son of man, thus says Adonai Yehovah, speak to the birds of every sort and to all the beasts of the field, assemble and come together, gather from all around to the sacrificial feast that I am preparing for you, a great sacrificial feast on the mountains of Israel, and you shall eat flesh and drink blood. You shall eat the flesh of the mighty and drink the blood of the princes of the earth, of rams, of lambs, and of he-goats, of bulls, all of them fat beasts of Bashan. And you shall eat fat till you are filled, and drink blood till you are drunk, at the sacrificial feast I am preparing for you. And you shall be filled at my table with horses and charioteers, with mighty men and all kinds of warriors, declares Adonai Yehovah. In Revelation 19, John also records that the flesh of those who ally themselves with the beast Gog will be eaten by scavenger birds. You see that over in Revelation 19, and we'll read verses 17 through 21. It says, Then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and with a loud voice he called to the birds that fly directly overhead, Come, gather for the great supper of God, to eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses and their riders, and the flesh of all men, both free and slave, both small and great. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against him who was sitting on the horse and against his army. And the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet, who in its presence had done the signs by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped its image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur, and the rest were slain by the sword that came from the mouth of him who was sitting on the horse, and all the birds were gorged with their flesh. And as we all know, the sword that proceeds from the mouth of the Messiah is the Word of God. So we see that in Hebrews 4:12. And by pronouncing judgment upon Gog and his armies for their rebellion, Jesus will bring upon them the wrath of God, resulting in complete destruction. Continuing on in Ezekiel 39, verses 21 through 24. He says, "And I will set my glory among the nations, and all the nations shall see my judgment that I have executed, and my hand that I have laid on them. The house of Israel shall know that I am Yehovah their Elohim from that day forward. And the nations shall know that the house of Israel went into captivity for their iniquity, because they dealt so treacherously with me that I hid my face from them and gave them into the hand of their adversaries, and they all fell by the sword. I dealt with them according to their uncleanness and their transgressions, and hid my face from them." So as I mentioned earlier, the destruction of the armies of God will once and for all reveal to Israel that Yehovah is their God. It will also make the nations recognize him and cause them to realize that he never truly abandoned Israel, but simply punished them and hid his face from them because of their wickedness, their sin. Ezekiel finishes this prophecy by recording God's promise to Israel. You look at Ezekiel 39, 25 through 29. It says, "Therefore thus says Adonai Yehovah, now I will restore the fortunes of Jacob, and have mercy on the whole house of Israel, and I will be jealous for my holy name. They shall forget their shame and all the treachery they have practiced against me, when they dwell securely in their land, with none to make them afraid. When I have brought them back from the peoples and gathered them from their enemies' lands, and through them have vindicated my holiness in the sight of many nations. Then they shall know that I am Yehovah their Elohim, because I sent them into exile among the nations, and then assembled them into their own land. I will leave none of them remaining among the nations anymore, and I will not hide my face any more from them, when I pour out my spirit upon the house of Israel, declares Adonai Yehovah." So clearly the aftermath of the Gog-Magog war is portrayed as the beginning of God once again favoring Israel. The pouring out of the Holy Spirit on the whole house of Israel will take place after the Messiah has destroyed God's enemies and regathered all Israel into the Holy Land. And this same thing is spoken of by the prophet Jeremiah. If you look at Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34. It says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares Yehovah, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares Yehovah. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares Yehovah. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts." Right? This is the new covenant. I will put my law within them. They will finally understand the law and do the law and keep the law. And I will write it on their hearts. This is that transformation that we go through when we have the Spirit of God dwelling in us. Right? When Paul said, "Be you transformed by the renewing of your mind," it's the same thing. Removing that heart of stone, giving us a heart of flesh. I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, Know Yehovah, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares Yehovah. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. Ezekiel 39 clearly indicates that God's intervention in destroying the armies of Gog is the beginning of a marvelous time for the regathered people of Israel. There's no room in this prophecy for a later battle of Armageddon. It just doesn't fit within the timeline, at least the way it appears. So once Jesus has returned and defeated the armies of Gog, the official beginning of the millennial reign of the Messiah will begin. And it will be a golden age, not only for Israel, but for the entire world. So in conclusion, brethren, despite what some teach about the battle of Gog and Magog, the Bible makes it clear that the conflict is the same one, popularly called the Battle of Armageddon in the book of Revelation. Both Ezekiel and Revelation record that this battle will feature an earthquake which will level the mountains and collapse all the cities of the world. They both state that huge hailstones will fall from the sky on the attackers. Both Ezekiel and Revelation show that the attackers who march against Israel will be slain in great numbers and become food for scavenger birds. So by comparing the similar points of the two prophecies, it becomes pretty clear that these two prophecies are different descriptions of the same event. Now, I would never say there's no room for dispute or debate, because there is, but it seems to be clear, anyway, that they are describing the same event. Therefore, we can be certain that the Battle of Gog-Magog and Armageddon is the final major rebellion of the nations against God before the start of the millennium. And the judgment of Jacob will be occurring at that same time. So it's like a, one stone that's, killing a lot of birds, so to speak. So, brethren, that's the end of the presentation for today. So we will stop there, and we will have our final hymn.